but I think teachers in Texas are scared is probably a good word about attracting attention to what they're doing in a way that's really negative, even when they think what they're doing is right and they're teaching historical facts and there's nothing wrong. But because the Holocaust was frankly a terrible event where really horrible things happened, they're worried that a parent will say, "How dare you expose my child to this information?"
This is Not to Forgive, but to Understand, a podcast series discussing genocide studies with experts and those connected to its critical questions.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
This is Not to Forgive, but to Understand. I am your host, Luis Gonzalez Aponte. As usual, I'm joined by my co-host, writer and scholar of genocide studies, Sabah Karim. Today we welcome Amy Frake, who is the Associate Director of Education at Holocaust Museum Houston. Amy is here today to talk to us about teaching the Holocaust in Texas. Hello, Amy. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being on the podcast.
Thank you for being here. So, to get straight into it, I wanted to go ahead and ask, what are the goals of Holocaust education at the Holocaust Museum Houston, in particular, what the education department strives to accomplish?
So at Holocaust Museum Houston, we have multiple different ways to try to approach teaching about the Holocaust. So we want to support teachers in teaching about the Holocaust, but we also go directly into schools to teaching about the Holocaust. And our main goal is just to provide information about the Holocaust for students as well as for teachers and the community. But within that, we want to try to help people understand the dangers of hatred, prejudice, and apathy. So trying to help people understand what are the lessons of the Holocaust, how can we apply those to issues that we see today, and try to learn from the mistakes of history to try to do better today.
So from my understanding, the education department is quite large and has a lot of resources compared to, perhaps other departments in this matter. Can you go ahead and inform our audience about what, say, events or resources or programs that you guys work with?
Definitely. So our signature program is called Educator in Motion. That's the program that I run here at the museum. So this program sends museum educators out into the community. We go to schools as well as community groups and anyone else who will have us, but we're primarily out in schools to talk about the Holocaust, human rights, other genocides. And so this program, we're a 3-person team. And last year we worked with about 30,000 students. That was across 30 school districts and 91 schools. So we have a pretty robust outreach across our community. This isn't just in Houston ISD. This is in school districts all around. We work primarily with public schools, but we also work with private schools. So this is our main program. We're trying to reach as many students as possible to teach them about the Holocaust. And then in addition to that, we train teachers. So we'll train teachers here at the museum. We also go out to campuses. We present at conferences. We work with professional development at the school district level. And we also have public programs that are here at the museum. And one of the most important things about all of our offerings is that when possible, and so as much as we can, they're bilingual in English and Spanish. So we're trying to be as accessible as possible for our community. A lot of the students that we work with in the Houston area are Latinx, and a lot of them speak Spanish as a first language. So we want to make sure that they're able to learn about a very difficult subject in the language they're most comfortable with.
Now, in there, you mentioned that the programs also include discussion on other genocides. Is that a selected list, or is it concerning all genocides recognized by the UN? Can you expand on that?
Definitely. So the list of genocides that we use is partially dictated by what's called the TEKS. So the TEKS are the standards that Texas teachers in public schools have to teach. So if we want to reach as many students as possible, the best way is to make sure that we're aligned with those TEKS. Those are what's tested. Those are what teachers are being held accountable for teaching. So there's 2 main places where genocide is required in the TEKS. It's partially in world history, which is 10th grade, and then there's some in world geography as well. So genocide is tested in a couple different places. So the main genocides that are in the TEKS are Darfur, Rwanda. There are teachers who want to talk about Armenia, and I think it's mentioned in one TEK. So it's mainly, though, being dictated by what's listed in there. We do try to bring in other genocides as well, though. So we talk a lot about what happened in Guatemala. We talk about Argentina. We talk about Bosnia, which Bosnia is in the TEKs. We talk about what's going on in China with the Uyghurs today. We talk about as many as we can, and we're trying to update constantly depending on current events. But the way that we kind of get into classrooms is focusing on what's actually supposed to be taught. So the way that we approach this is we start with the UN Genocide Convention, and we talk students through the convention, have them analyze some of the language, think about who's being protected by this, who is kind of being not quite as protected by this, what does it mean? Because usually when I ask students, what does genocide mean? What is genocide? They'll say it's mass killing. And so we're using the convention to really help students broaden their idea of what genocide actually means and helping them understand how there's way more that makes something into a genocide, and that it's not as simple as just any mass killing counts as a genocide. So we use the convention to try to help them understand that. And then after that, we often will give them individual case studies. And what's interesting is that sometimes it's based on the TEKs, sometimes it's based on what a particular teacher wants to work with, but often we get requests for, I would like to talk about these specific genocides. So because the Madres at the Plaza de Mayo are a TEK that's included, there was one school that said they wanted us to talk about Argentina and then Darfur and Rwanda, because those are the TEKs that they wanted to cover. So sometimes we're not quite restricted, but the idea is please focus on these. Other times we have a lot more freedom to bring in more case studies that we think students should know about.
So one of the questions I have is, since you mentioned, and this is for our audience, because I want to bring this out very clearly. When you say that you've been making sure that students are taught what's genocide, the definition of genocide beyond mass killing, what are the other areas that you've been teaching, these students?
So using the convention as kind of the starting point, we talk about the broader ways that you can destroy a group. So especially some of the acts of genocide, for example, preventing births within a group and separating children, so transferring children from one group to another. But we also try to talk about what cultural destruction can look like and how there are various ways that you can destroy a group of people. And so we'll try to have discussions with them about, what does destroying a group mean? What would that look like? And thinking about how it would be a little bit different depending on the type of group that you're targeting and who's being targeted in the first place.
And so my next question is then, I'm very curious. I'm imagining the scene here in front of me where you're teaching them all of this. I'm curious, how do they react to you? And, you've had this firsthand experience, so I'm very curious.
Teaching about genocide, especially, so we mainly focus on high school students when we talk about genocide, is very interesting because it's a big challenge because students tend to have so little background. It's really difficult because you're asking them to comprehend a lot of things at once. So often, if you think about some of these examples, Darfur, Rwanda, Armenia, Bosnia, these are places that students sometimes have never heard of. They have no conception of what kind of people live in these places, the environments people live in, their histories. And so having to bring in all of that and give them enough information that they can understand why different groups have specific relations, why people would want to be killing one another, in addition to who are these groups in the first place. And then also in many of these cases, you have concepts like colonialism that get brought in. So it's a lot of concepts that students sometimes can struggle with. And so I think that's why often the Holocaust is what gets taught, because students have a grounding in that. They learn about World War II. They learn more about Europe than they tend to about other continents. And so they have more background knowledge. Teaching about other genocides is so challenging because they just don't have the background knowledge a lot of the time. And instead of being able to spend an entire class period like I might with the Holocaust, I'm having to often talk about multiple genocides in a 45-minute span. But students are interested. I think the highest compliment I ever received was I did a program with some high schoolers on the genocides. And afterwards, I was cleaning up some materials, and this high school girl was talking to her friend, and she said, that was actually interesting. So once you talk to students about this, they often care a lot. They're really interested. Students get frustrated and angry about, well, why are we talking about this? Why has no one told me about this before? So I think there's a lot of interest once it's been introduced, but this isn't really something that students spend a lot of time with. I'll often ask them, because people start to ask, well, could we change the Genocide Convention, for example? And I'll say, well, when was the last time you thought about genocide? No one's thinking about the Genocide Convention. There's no worldwide movement to change the Genocide Convention. But they'll get passionate, they'll get angry, they'll get frustrated. Why would someone do something like this? So I think it's something there's a lot of interest in, even though it is a pretty depressing subject for students. I think when it's presented to them and they're involved and engaged, I think students can be very interested.
I have one more question regarding all of this. You and Laurie Garcia are invited to the symposium at Texas State University that will take place between the 1st and 12th April this year. You'll be holding a lecture on teaching the Holocaust in Texas, which is exactly the title of our podcast today. I'm curious, as a foreigner myself in America, is there anything particular about teaching the Holocaust in Texas? Or do you think that it would be the same experience across America? Is there anything unique that you have seen about teaching the Holocaust in this area?
It's a really interesting question. So having not taught in the rest of the country, but gone to school in several different states, the U.S. is so different in so many different ways, and sometimes in ways that are almost bizarre, just thinking about we're all the same country, but we can be so different. I can't speak for the entirety of Texas. Obviously, I'm mainly focused on the Houston area, and I do recognize that there are some things that make even the Houston area unique versus the Panhandle, versus the Austin area, versus other parts, versus the border. So obviously, Texas has a lot of differences. But from my experience working in Houston and then with teachers from all over, some of the challenges are just the politics and the way that politics have really been infiltrating into schools. And I know this is happening in other states. The advantage with Holocaust education is it isn't as bad for Holocaust education as it is for some other subjects, but it starts to creep in different ways. Teachers are sometimes very hesitant about what they teach and what they expose students to. And they're often worried about the reactions that parents or superintendents or principals will have to content. So I have a lot of concern about, well, are you going to show my students graphic images? What are you going to be talking about? I have teachers who want to preview the presentation. And I do think some of this, I'm sure, is happening in other states as well. But I think teachers in Texas are scared, is probably a good word, about attracting attention to what they're doing in a way that's really negative, even when they think what they're doing is right and they're teaching historical facts and there's nothing wrong. But because the Holocaust was, frankly, a terrible event where really horrible things happened, they're worried that a parent will say, how dare you expose my child to this information? So there's a lot of kind of worry there.
I'm curious about actual examples of parents opposing the teaching and the learning process of the Holocaust. I'm just curious about that. Do you think you could explain that a little bit more for our audience?
Sure. So I don't see this as much because usually I'm going through teachers. And so if they have complaints, it doesn't happen. So we have, for example, this year, we had a session on the Holocaust that was canceled. They told us it was postponed. I think it's definitely canceled. There was an incident last year at the middle school where I went for 8th grade, actually. This was the school that I attended for 8th grade. And the 8th graders were doing a whole Holocaust unit in English. So they read Anne Frank's diary. I think they read Night as well. They read a lot of Holocaust literature. It's a whole unit. And so I went in and did a presentation about rescue during the Holocaust. So pretty much as positive as you can possibly get. And the teacher told me he sends out an email every week telling parents what's going on. And there was a parent who said that they did not want their student included in my presentation, and they spent the presentation in the hall. And so I don't get to know why exactly that is. There's probably a lot of different reasons why that parent made that choice. I found it especially interesting because this is an entire Holocaust unit, but there was a specific objection. And so that student was pulled out.
Amy, as we acknowledge the challenges that educators and advocates face, given what you just spoke about, one instance that received a lot of attention and where the Carroll Independent School District in Texas, and North Texas specifically, faced criticism after an administrator suggested that teachers should provide, quote, opposing perspectives to books about the Holocaust, citing a new Texas law encouraging diverse viewpoints on controversial views. I mean, this incident sparked a lot of concerns, of course, but how do you believe such challenges affect students and their understanding of history, as well as any lessons of the Holocaust?
So it's laws like that that have kind of, when I talk about politics, kind of infiltrating schools. I think that is part of how this happens. So laws like that, it's a really vague law. So it's this idea of opposing perspectives. And obviously you can't have opposing perspectives about the Holocaust in the sense that if you provide a perspective from a Holocaust survivor and a perspective from a Nazi, those things should not be presented to students as equal. I've heard some varying information about that particular incident, that the administrator was potentially just trying to help their teachers handle that law and kind of cover up make sure that they didn't get in trouble with the law. But because they're vague, there's a lot of fear out there. So I don't think that most teachers in Texas are teaching Nazi perspectives, for example, as part of this. I think most people realize that the Holocaust was not the main target of this law. So, but it does impact things in terms of fear. I had a teacher that I've worked with for several years who told me she went to her administrator at the beginning of the year and she said, based on the law as I read it, some of what I'm teaching is illegal, but it's also in the TEKS. It's what I'm required to teach. So what do you want me to do? And her administrator said, teach it at the end of the year, which means it never got around. It wasn't taught because it got shuffled to the end of the year and it just never happened. So I think what it means is sometimes students aren't getting education on controversial topics. They aren't hearing interesting perspectives because of some of this fear. Once again, this is impacting Holocaust education less, I think, than other topics that in Texas are considered more controversial. We're lucky enough that we have a pretty robust system in Texas. So there is the Texas Commission on Holocaust, Genocide, and Anti-Semitism. This commission helps support teachers, it helps support museums, and the commission is done. There are appointed commissioners who are appointed by the governor, and then there are employees who help support. So we work really closely with the commission when we can, and they're also out there helping provide resources for teaching about the Holocaust for teachers. So if people have questions about how do I apply this law, what do I do, they can answer some of those questions as it relates to the Holocaust. And we can try to help teachers with that as well. But the commission, because they're a government institution, they're kind of the official word if people have questions. So we're lucky that we have that commission and teachers have that support. They may not always know that it exists, but if they can find that information, they at least have some support. So I know that there are some stereotypes about Texas, but it's not quite the negative wasteland that I think it's sometimes portrayed as. Texas is an incredibly diverse state. There are really incredible educators who are working really hard to make sure that students learn about the Holocaust and other genocides. And then there are museums that support, nonprofits that support, and the commission supporting. So we're honestly very lucky in some of the support that we have.
For context for our audience, that which is in the TEKS and what you are consulting whenever you're going to these schools and these outreach programs is what is ultimately going to be on standardized tests for students to take at the end of the year. Is that a concern in the matter as well? Because I would expect, or I would imagine, That which is going to be or planned to be tested on is going to, of course, influence the curriculum. And one of the most important questions that I wanted to ask you today was, what steps can communities and educational authorities take to safeguard the integrity of Holocaust education materials and curricula in Texas?
So the TEKs come from the legislature. And so if you care about Holocaust education in Texas, talk to the legislature, talk to your representatives, send them letters, tell them this is important to you. You can get connected with the commission as well, but the legislature is really who is dictating all of this, and the TEKs are reworked every few years. The idea is to keep them updated. So if this is something that people care about, it's political leaders that need to be talked to, because everyone else, I think, is on board. Teachers really care about this subject. I work with so many teachers who really want to make sure their kids understand this subject. There are multiple Holocaust museums in Texas, and they are working to do this. The commission is working to provide support and knowledge for students, for teachers, for the community. So everybody else is on board. It's just important to let the legislature know that this is something that's really important to us, and that we want to make sure that it continues to be included in what students are taught. Because if it's not on the TEKs, it will take an individual teacher making specific time to teach that subject. And so if it's not in the TEKs, it's probably not getting taught, definitely not across the whole state.
To go back again regarding how the museum includes discussion on multiple or different genocides within its outreach programs, Sabah, I would like your perspective on this. Given your position in the scholarly field, do you encounter situations where individuals perceive the Holocaust as the preeminent genocide compared to others, and how do you navigate such perspectives?
I think it's refreshing to hear you, Amy, speak about the fact that many different genocides are taught in the program, because there has been, if you look at the history of genocide studies, and it's a very recent history, which is why we're very excited about, opening many new institutions, organizing conferences in this field, because we can rightly say that after Raphael Lemkin spoke about genocide or coined the term in the late 40s, it took about 35 years for the first, conferences, for the first books on genocide to be, published. And so the history of genocide studies is relatively new. And at the beginning, there was a focus entirely on Holocaust education, and that's why many of the departments which opened up were based on Holocaust studies. It's only with time that there came to be comparative genocide studies that emerged as a new field of study, where we started to expand into exploring other genocides and talking about other genocides. And then there came to be another debate about which is the quintessential genocide that we should look up to as a model, or which is the worst, or which is the most, important in that sense at the end of the day. So there came to be all these debates, and people were divided for a very long time on this subject, and they still are, for that matter. So it's refreshing to see that the focus is not entirely on the Holocaust, because, of course, the Holocaust is important to study, but we also know that because the Genocide Convention today is based so much on the template of the Holocaust, it necessarily excludes other types of mass atrocities from the bigger picture of things. So being able to study other genocides or other pockets of the world that have been plagued by mass atrocity is good. It's a good way forward. And that's why I think that hearing Amy today is very reassuring as a genocide studies scholar.
I'm very interested, Amy, to hear about how the museum and the education department shapes your own curriculum and your own programs that you decide to work with students on. I saw on your website a myriad of resources for teachers, and I wondered if you guys have particular individuals in the community that you work with, if you guys develop everything on your own, or if even donors and advocates for the museum have a say on what you're able to do.
So we work with a lot of different people, especially in kind of an advisory capacity. So we have an advisory council of teachers that works with the education department. So we meet quarterly and we talk to them. We want to know what's going on out in their campuses, because while we're out on school campuses a lot, we're not always seeing what's going on behind the scenes. What are the debates that people are having? So book bannings, for example. What's going on with that? What pressure are you facing from your district? What's going right? So we like to ask those questions, and it helps us understand, what do teachers need? Because what we're really focused on more than anything else is what will be useful for teachers and for their students. So we work with that council of teachers. We also have a committee of board members that we work with, where we're updating them about, here's what we're working on, and they let us know feedback about what they'd like us to do. The decision rests with us, but they're also kind of in an advisory capacity, helping us understand what is important to them. Donors do play a role in terms of what they fund and what gets funded, what has interest, what we have resources to create, but we don't necessarily have to get specific donations or funds in order to work on something if we think that it's important. So, for example, I wrote a few years ago some micro lessons, so lessons that can be done in like 10 minutes or less, kind of quick things for Genocide Awareness Month. So just so that if a teacher wanted to do something for Genocide Awareness Month, they had something they could do in their classroom and it wouldn't interrupt the rest of their curriculum. Because usually it's like, I'd really love to talk about that, but I don't have time, I don't have space. So here, you have 10 minutes somewhere. Hopefully you can make that work. So if a subject is really important to us, we also try to do that. If we're hearing things in the community, so for example, making sure as much as bilingual as possible is reacting to our community. So all of our museum exhibits are also bilingual in English and Spanish. And that was a reaction to seeing how many visitors were coming through who spoke Spanish, sometimes and English, sometimes just Spanish. And what I love seeing about the exhibits, especially, is how they can really foster multi-generational conversations. So the first day we opened the new exhibit that was bilingual, I remember being in the gallery and there was, I think it was a father and his daughter, that kind of relationship. And they were having a really in-depth conversation in Spanish about what they were seeing in the gallery. And so they were able to do that because we had that resource available. So we're trying to think about, yes, what interests us, what's important to us, but also what is important to our community, what's important to the students and teachers that we serve. And so that's why we're so directed by the TEEPs, because we know that's what teachers need. And we're trying to make things as accessible to students as possible. So to give you kind of an example of kind of the way that priorities can go, for several years now, we've wanted to create an anti-Semitism toolkit to talk about anti-Semitism and to give teachers lessons and resources for teaching about anti-Semitism. This is something we've been concerned about for years. It's not something we started being concerned about this year, but there were other priorities, there were grants we had to fulfill. And then in about the last year or so, we've had a lot more interest in, what are you doing to fight anti-Semitism? So we've been able to kind of reprioritize that. And so that's my next big project for curriculum writing, is creating that anti-Semitism toolkit. So that was kind of a combination of, we cared about that in the education department, and now we have donors who care about it. We have community members who care about it, and that's kind of all come together.
Before, you mentioned about the intention to ban books in Texas schools. Of course, we may have heard about a school district in Texas which banned a graphic novel adaptation of Anne Frank's diary. And I wondered, do you find that Holocaust education may inadvertently attract attention of extremist groups such as neo-Nazis and other groups like the sort?
Not in our experience. That doesn't mean it never happens. I've just not heard of major examples. The example you're mentioning with the adaptation of Anne Frank's diary, the complaint was about sexual content, and struggles with her sexuality. She talks and thinks about sex, and she also talks about menstruation. Those tend to scare people in Texas a lot more than the Holocaust does. And so if you look at the books that are mostly being targeted in Texas, those tend to be the subjects that get the most attention. So usually Holocaust education isn't experiencing that to the same degree. It doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but it's not to the same degree. And we're lucky enough that most people beyond the extremist fringe recognize that saying we shouldn't talk about the Holocaust is a little socially taboo. And so because of that, we have a little bit of extra protection. There's a reason that the banning of that book got so much attention, because it's Anne Frank's diary. It's a book about the Holocaust. And so that kind of drives more attention, and it helps keep some of these things from happening more to literature related to the Holocaust.
One of the things I wanted to ask you is the experiences you have just engaging with that crowd and that age group. I think the prejudices they have, the preconceived notions they have, I'm just curious about those experiences.
I actually love working with students because they actually give me hope in a world where we're so divided and you see bias and prejudice everywhere. Students can be more open-minded than sometimes I think we give them credit for. So there are some particularly negative experiences I've had where I've had kids say things that were not great to me. I think the one that always sticks out is the sixth grader who told me after the presentation on the Holocaust that, and at least he didn't say this to the rest of the class, he just said this to me. So I am grateful for that. But he said, well, my brother in the military told me it's a good thing that the Holocaust happened, or the Jews would have taken over the world. So that was not my favorite thing to hear. And I had about 30 seconds before the bell rang to try to convince this kid. And, who am I to compete with this kid's brother in the military, who I'm sure he idolizes, but trying to say, well, think about what we just saw in the presentation. Were Jews actually going to take over the world? Does that make sense given what we learned about what it means to be Jewish? Asking him like very rapid fire questions to try to do that. But beyond some and those are very rare things, mostly the reactions I get from students are they're upset about what happened during the Holocaust. They get angry about what happened during the Holocaust. I was in a classroom just yesterday with, once again, sixth graders, and we're talking about anti-Jewish laws. And I had kids getting really upset. Why would they do that? How could they do that? How could they treat people like that? And so kids, yes, they have their prejudices and they have all the things that they hear around them, but they're also willing to think outside of that space a lot of the time. So yes, you get the drama. On Tuesday, there was a girl in my session who had someone put gum in her hair. I mean, you have that's unfortunately kind of the typical school stuff, but they are very thoughtful a lot of the time about what they're hearing. And they're often making connections to other histories, to present day, to other genocides that they've heard about sometimes. So I'm always really uplifted when I hear students say, well, this reminds me of this. These anti-Jewish laws really make me think about segregation in the United States. Yeah, there's the same idea, right? Is to separate groups of people. You got it. You're understanding where we're coming from. So they don't just see the Holocaust as, well, this is a bad thing. It happened a long time ago. We're done and over with that. They understand how, well, these things can and do continue to happen again. And I'll ask them, have people been targeted or been killed because of who they are since the Holocaust? And almost every kid I work with, 6th grade through 12th grade, says yes. They know that, and they can make those connections. If I ask, why is it worth learning about the Holocaust? And I start pretty much everything I do with, what do you know about the Holocaust? Defining the Holocaust, and then asking, why should we learn about the Holocaust in the first place? And the most common answer I get is, we don't want it to happen again. And I know that that's a canned answer. I know that's what they're supposed to say, but kids genuinely do believe it. They don't want this kind of thing to happen. And so it's really cool to see how much students do care. And when they get upset and when they get, well, how could people do that? And they start to question, that's really amazing. So I think sometimes we're not being as nice to kids as I think we should be. They are kids, and they have everything that goes with that. But a lot of them are also incredibly thoughtful. They really care about the people around them, their communities, their country, and their world, and they do want to make them better.
Is this a relatively new perspective that is being shown by these students? Because after speaking to some of my own students, I work in Texas public schools, and as well as talking to people from other countries, a common approach to Holocaust education, as far as I've seen, would be to approach it as just a fact of history. And many students go ahead and just remark on the dates that they would have learned about, the names they would have learned about. Very rarely do you hear the words like empathy come up. And I'm curious to hear if you believe that it's just a recent development in Texas public schools for students to go ahead and have this kind of approach.
My guess is it probably is. I was in Texas public schools from 8th grade through 12th grade, and that was definitely how the Holocaust was taught to me, is it's a historical event, it's over, here are the dates. I think we read, when I was in 8th grade, I read the play version of Anne Frank's diary, not even her actual diary. We read Night, and it's basically like, learn about the bad stuff that happened in the past and let's move on. And that's actually why I'm so passionate about Holocaust education in the first place. I hated learning about the Holocaust as a kid. I was not a very happy child in 8th grade. It was my third middle school in 3 years. Obviously, that's not like going through the Holocaust, but I didn't want to be more sad than I already was. And so I really did not like learning about it. It was only learning about the Holocaust in college, having conversations with professors, with other students, really learning more and reading more, that I started to ask questions about why would humans do that to other humans, and how does this connect to present day? So it does seem like this is kind of new. I also hope it's partly me attempting to do my job, and I really try to ask students and get them to make these connections and think. So I'm not going to tell them what the connections are, but I am going to try to ask them questions that help them make those connections. So I hope that that's something I'm helping students do. And I also think if you think about a lot of what students learn and how they're learning about the Holocaust, either it's dates, which no one empathizes with dates, they're numbers. It's not going to help anyone really learn and understand the actual what's actually happening during an event. Or if they're learning an English class, a major feature of particularly Anne Frank's diary is you really don't hear about perpetrators. You don't hear about why the Nazis are doing what they're doing, why Anne Frank and her family are in hiding. You get pieces of that. They talk about what's going on, but that's not the major focus of what she's talking about. And with Night, you don't really get the buildup to the Holocaust. You don't get why are Adolf Hitler and the Nazis coming into power? What are they doing before the Holocaust? And so I think if you give students more of the buildup, you help them understand that genocide is a process. The Nazis don't show up on day one and start, murdering people. It takes a lot of time to put these things in place. There are stages of genocide. Helping students understand this, I think, can also help them think through, because you're looking at individual events. If you only look at the most extreme examples, if all you learn about are concentration camps, the major comparison most kids have for concentration camps is North Korea. That tends to be where the connection they make is, this sounds kind of like what I learned about with North Korea. And sometimes that's because teachers will say, what are in North Korea are concentration camps. So there's really not a lot of critical thinking happening there. But if you talk about anti-Jewish laws, then it's a lot easier for them to make connections, because they're seeing more of the process. They're seeing more of how these things happen. And it's a lot easier, I think, for them to make those comparisons. So I think it's teaching the whole process of the Holocaust rather than just the consequences, just the camps. That's not the whole of the Holocaust. And so I think especially when teachers are providing that background and when I'm working through all of that, it helps students make those connections much better.
I have a last question. You mentioned the contact point that you're having is with the students, and you're teaching them, and this is a very new pedagogical way of teaching them. And I appreciate the fact that you spoke specifically about moving away from just teaching them dates, for instance, because that's something I think a lot of us went through and we found that exceedingly boring about, when learning history. So in this more engaging approach that you have adopted, do you think that this learning, and we all hope for this as educators, do you think that this teaching is then being transmitted from the students maybe to their parents and beyond?
I hope so. We encourage students to come to the museum, bring your parents. I like to tell students, come show your parents what you learned, right? So you have learned enough that come to the gallery, show them, I learned about this. Let me tell you what I learned. And allowing students to be a little bit of an expert and letting them be a teacher and show, I know this, can be so empowering for students who, usually it's just do this, do that. It can be really great to give students that power. So I hope that they're passing that along when they do that. That would be really amazing. But all we can do is give students the tools. And once again, I know there are a lot of biases about students today, but I really do think that they're up to the challenge.
Amy, can you go ahead and give us perhaps a call to action for our viewers? Maybe perhaps those who are not in Houston. Of course, if they are in Houston, please go visit the Holocaust Museum Houston. However, if they're not in the area, what can these people go ahead and do to promote and, of course, advocate for Holocaust education, whether it's visiting your website and so on?
So our website does have some resources. I will be perfectly honest with you. If you want the best resources that there are in the United States, the museum in DC is the place to go. So they have so many fantastic resources, so much that they can do to help people learn. Their Holocaust Encyclopedia is an incredible resource. So if people have resources about, like if you have questions about the Holocaust, if you go to ushmm.org or Google Holocaust Museum, Washington, D.C., their Holocaust Encyclopedia is great. I think one of the big things is if you're going to talk about the Holocaust, and we do this all the time, people talk about the Holocaust constantly. If you're going to talk about, honestly, any genocide, please make sure that you have your facts before you talk about it, because there is so much misinformation, and some of it is really well-intentioned. So I still hear constantly students, teachers telling me that 11 million people died in the Holocaust. And this is not the total number. The number is significantly higher, but this is a number that Simon Wiesenthal comes up with years ago and basically pulls it out of thin air. And the idea is it's supposed to be 6 million Jews and 5 million others. And it's kind of meant to try to bring people in and want them to care about the Holocaust. But this number isn't accurate. And we don't have a precise number, but it's far higher than 11 million. So if you're going to teach about the Holocaust, if you're going to talk about the Holocaust, please be willing to do some research, look up your facts, use real sources like the Holocaust Museum in Houston or the museum in DC or any of the other wonderful museums around the country and the world. But every time we say something, even if it's incredibly well-intentioned about the Holocaust, if it's wrong, we are opening the door for deniers. We're opening the door for the continued spread of misinformation about that. So there's a lot of things that people can do, but please just, if you're not sure, consult your sources, make sure you're not passing on additional misinformation.
Thank you so much for your great insights today. We and our audience greatly appreciate it, Amy. Again, Amy Frake is the Associate Director of Education at Holocaust Museum Houston. Again, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
This was Not to Forgive, but to Understand with our guest, Amy Frake. To our listeners, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more discussions. If you would like to see and hear more from our guest, she will be speaking on Teaching the Holocaust in Texas, with her colleague Lori Garcia presenting on the art exhibition of Samuel Bach's Holocaust paintings at the Genocide Awareness Symposium held in April 2024 at Texas State University.